everyone. I'm Michele Farrell. I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Institute of Museum and Library Services in the Grants to States program. Got that out of the way. We're here in this half an hour period to talk about celebrating the American with Disabilities Act. This year is the 25th anniversary of the ADA, and libraries have been providing services for a long time to that clientele, and I thought it was a good idea if IMLS did that. For those of you who are here in the back of the room, one of our national medal winners, the Braille Institute, has set up a display of assistive technologies that they make available to people in the community that need it. And what we're going to do now is just do an interview with one of our colleagues and grantees. But first, I'd like to give you an idea of why we think this is important. Right now, we estimate there's 43 million people with disabilities. Now, here's something to think about. In this day and age of big data, we only have estimates on the number of people with disabilities. Rather interesting. But here's another fact. In the next 15 years, by 2030, there's going to be 75 million people over 65, and they estimate that almost 40, I've got the number here wrong, about half of those people are going to be people with disabilities and need assistance. So if you're talking about planning and assessment, we talked about it earlier, it's definitely something to look at and plan for in your communities. And today I have Dr. Lisa Verne here to have a conversation about this. She's the program manager for education, research, and partnership at Benetech Labs and its global literacy services, which includes Bookshare and Diagram. She's also one of our grantees. She's the project lead on a project called 3D Printing, New Educational Opportunities for Students with Print Disabilities. And she is also a project lead on a private grant that supports parents for children with learning differences. She is a doctorate in special education and policy from the University of California at Berkeley and San Francisco State University. It's a joint doctoral program with a focus on teachers' beliefs about including children with special needs in typically developing classrooms. She has 15 years of research in the educational area with particular expertise in special education policy and law, inclusion and family, and school collaboration. She's currently interested in the use of technology in classrooms for meaningful inclusion. In addition to her position at Benetech, I don't know when this woman sleeps, she's a guest lecturer, adjunct faculty member, and master student supervisor at San Francisco State University. She holds an MS, or let me go back, a BS in Business Administration and Marketing from Villanova University, and an MA in Early Childhood Special Education from Santa Clara University. So welcome.
Welcome, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, when we talked about the ADA and the celebration, the actual date is July 26th, but our hope is that people will celebrate it throughout the year. This year, with it marking the 25th anniversary, can you talk broadly about the scope of ADA, what it covers, and where we are now?
Sure. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law. It prohibits discrimination based on disability. It includes physical and mental disabilities, and it's similar to the protections from 1964 civil rights laws. And although the law was enacted in 1990, we started thinking about disability rights way, way before that. Okay, in the early 70s, so not that early. But, so in most of our lifetime, people with disabilities weren't protected or didn't have necessarily the same rights and protections that all other citizens of the United States had. And the first version was introduced to the House and the Senate in 1988, but wasn't actually passed until 1990. And recently retired Senator Harkin wrote the final version for the 1990 pass and approval. And when he delivered his speech to the House to talk about why this was important and why we needed to vote on rights for people with disabilities, he actually presented most of the presentation in sign language so that his brother could hear as well. One of the big differences, though, between the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and ADA of 1990 is that we look at accommodations and what employers need to provide to their employees, but also what accessibility requirements are required on public entities and public accommodations. So as librarians and libraries, what are the things that we need to think about that need to be available, and what accommodations do we need to make to support people with disabilities in your institutions? When we talk about accommodations, we're talking about reasonable accommodations. That could be special equipment. It could be different times to schedule meetings. It could also be how we communicate information to people. What I found when I was doing some research on ADA, and just what I thought was a pretty interesting statement, was when we look at accommodations for people with disabilities, about 57% of those accommodations are free. There are little things that we can do to make access to the information just a little easier. So we're not looking at things that are going to cost hundreds and millions and thousands of dollars. We're looking at things that could be minor changes that could be free. Employers are not required to provide accommodations that are significantly difficult or expensive either. But we need to think about what are the things, again, that we can do. Public entities that get local or state or federal funding, must comply with these. And these regulations cover access to all the programs and services that public entities provide, or that they provide out to their people.
Well, when I think back to, as part of my grant monitoring, I go to many libraries, and one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that people have developed websites, and they list on there that they provide services to people who need assistive devices. But broadly speaking, do you see any other progress and examples of progress that you see in the field, or changes, broadly speaking, in services to this community?
Sure. Well, the biggest thing is that it's no longer a charitable act to provide accommodations for someone with a disability. It is the law. And when we talk about websites specifically, as you and I were speaking earlier, oftentimes information for people with disabilities is way down on the bottom or hidden on a few different pages. Bringing some of that information to the forefront is really important, but also how the website is designed to work with accommodations, to work with screen readers for people with visual impairments or learning disabilities, are important to figure out, how do we actually communicate this information. So any structure that has been built since 1992 is required to be ADA compliant. And anything else that was built before 1992, people have to work to get rid of the barriers that would prohibit someone from accessing information or accessing even access into a building. Some of those things are like ramps, elevators, library stacks have to be certain dimensions so that wheelchairs can fit in between. But I think, to really answer your question, Michele, although we've made some progress in the 25 years, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the next 25 years. One thing is ADA is not an education law. As I said, it's a civil rights law. But schools very much, if you look at the structure of schools, are very segregated by having kids in special ed in their own programming. We need to focus on people's abilities and less on their disability and figure out how we can support them to be successable. One of the other things, too, that I often hear is, well, how do we talk to someone with a disability, or how do we address someone with a disability? And I wanted to introduce you to what we call person-first language. When you think about a person with a disability, they really are a person and not their disability. There are some exceptions, but for the majority, person-first language, thinking about a person with a disability, a person who is blind, a person with a learning difference, they are definitely a person first and a disability second.
Well, it's interesting because when I was looking up some information and I read that 13 million people use assistive devices, and I keep thinking, that would be about a fourth of my friends. And then there's me raising the volume on my smartphone and widening the screen to see a picture and just facing reality there. So that's why I know so well things that you never think is coming is actually coming to a library near you. And what I enjoy discussing with Lisa, as we talked earlier, is talking outside our field and talking to the partners, the schools, special ed teachers, any other organizations, service organizations for the blind and the deaf, et cetera, who are out there who can provide lots of assistance and advice to your staff, even if you're a very small rural library somewhere, as well as your professional associations. How do you think we could be more inclusive in terms of technology? I know technology is one of your interests.
Technology is a very big interest. And one of the things to consider is some of the accommodations and things that have been built into some technology products, many of you use on a regular basis. How many of you listen to books at all? Or maybe use your iPhone, right, or your cell phones? How many of you use the magnifying feature on your cell phone?
Yeah, all the time.
Right. These are things that companies are now putting into place that are not just for people with disabilities, but are for all people. And I think that's something to think about. When we think about technology and think about the things we need to change and want to improve, while having someone with a disability in mind is important, there are so many other people in the world who could benefit from some of the upgrades and technological enhancements that many of us use. My husband uses his phone like this, and I had to explain to him how we can actually make things bigger. Right? So that's large fun. He doesn't have a disability. He's just old, as I am too. I'll be fair. But many of you are already doing some of these things. As I talked about, putting in ramps into buildings, but having computer desks that are accessible for someone in a wheelchair. We see that. We see a lot of this happening. While not Americans with Disability Act, Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act that was passed in 1973 ensures that electronic information and technology that we buy, that we develop or maintain, must be accessible. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today, and one of the things that we can think about doing, is buying things that are accessible. How many of you have digital books or use digital books for people you work with? I see some head shaking, right? Are all those digital books accessible? Ooh, head shaking stopped. I'm thinking there's some questions. No, the answer is no. We are working with a number of publishers on an initiative called Born Accessible. When people are going to be creating things in a digital format, we want it created in an accessible format to start, because it's about 800 times more expensive to convert a digital file back into an accessible digital file. But if you can create those things in advance, then we won't have to do any retrofitting. And then buying accessible. So understanding what products are accessible to begin with. And I'm not going to go through it today, but I have a chart that I'm more than willing to share if anyone's interested that talks about, what to look for in ebooks. What are some of the things? Things that we would think would be simple, like the text is available in a logical reading order. Well, yeah. But oftentimes in digital books, that might not be put into the actual files. Also, that tables and headers have captions. So for persons with visual impairments or people who may not be able to actually read the text on a page, oftentimes images are inaccessible. And when we think about things like math and science, everything's embedded in those images. So screen readers aren't even reading them. So we want to make sure that we're purchasing things that have descriptions, image descriptions. And as you mentioned, Diagram is one of our initiatives that we work on. Well, the Diagram Center, which is about accessible images, has a product called Poet. And this is something more for publishers. We do a lot of work with publishers to actually put in and have people work on putting in descriptions of the images that you see, long descriptions. Now, the funny little T that starts the in the first sentence, that doesn't need an image description. But when we think about a complex image of the water cycle, to have someone who can actually talk about and describe what is going on in that picture gives access to the people who are reading the books or accessing the books in various ways. So I'll stop there, but I think we have more.
And it isn't just IMLS and the library world that is interested in this. I recently went to a hackathon sponsored by the Department of Commerce, and it was specifically designed for hackers to work with people who have disabilities, to bring those communities together to try to design new equipment, devices, and software. So, everybody's thinking about this. It's not a segmented kind of thing. It's broad. And speaking about that, are there other issues in terms of accessibility-wise that other sectors are changing or making that we can learn from?
Well, I think the example of your iPhone, many of you have one. I saw all the heads nodding. It shows an example that it's someone who's out of education and out of the book publishing, although they have their own section of that too, but who are doing some of the work to think about how do we put accessible functionality into things that we're using. We're at a really great and crucial moment here where we have a perfect storm of conditions. We have a great need. As you pointed out, there are quite a few million people with disabilities. we have a great opportunity. Technology is changing things so fast that oftentimes, I get up to speak and something's changed and I have to revamp real quick. And there's also an explosion for funding for new technologies. So bringing all of these things together, it's time to now create the social tipping point that content creation and making things that are accessible happen now rather than, like I said, in retrospect. So I did already mention that we're working with publishers quite a bit through our Born Accessible initiative. But there's some other things that people are working on, and I'll talk about some of the projects we have right now. As you mentioned, Bookshare. Bookshare is an online digital platform of accessible materials. For students who are in K-12 and post-secondary or in degree-earning positions, from a grant from the Department of Special Education Programming, we're able to offer that for free. So if you think about someone who has trouble reading, you think about reading a traditional book. You have to hold the book. You have to be able to turn the page. You have to be able to see the words, and you have to be able to decode the words. If at some point that is not happening, that person is not accessing the material in the book. And so Bookshare provides opportunities to have accessible digital material for them at their disposal. As you mentioned also, we are working on a grant, thanks to IMLS, on 3D printing for education. We know that people learn things in many different ways. How many of you have 3D printers or have been dabbling in 3D printing? Great. We're looking at that right now. We're actually in 2 weeks from tomorrow, it's getting close, we're pulling together a national consortium of people for a forum, educators, libraries, museums, end users, and technologists, to talk about the implications for 3D printing in the classroom, to figure out who should be printing and what they should be printing and why they should be printing and for whom. Because someone with a visual impairment may learn very differently than someone with a learning disability. We have to have different ways to convey that information to them. And then how do we build the pedagogy around these objects so that it's not just a random object being handed to someone saying, okay, learn. We see libraries as being one of those places where they could be a great asset in this field. Because as some of you had already indicated, you're thinking about this already. You're doing this. But how do we connect you to the right people? How do we connect places? How do teachers know what you have or what they can get from you? So we'll have a report later this year that will sum up our findings from 2 weeks from now. But if anyone is interested in learning about that faster or sooner or participating, my email information is on the contact sheet. I also mentioned Poet, which is the image description tool that we're working with so that people can actually write long image descriptions. And we're also working on something called MathML Cloud, because often math in books is also an image. And so people aren't able to access the formulas that they need to be successful and to go on. MathML Cloud, M as in Mary, L as in Lisa. And a dream of mine and looking towards the future far down the road, how great would it be to have all of those things I just mentioned in a book so that someone who has a digital version of that book can click on the math equation that will read to them in a format that works. Or someone can click on, I want to order this object from wherever, or I want to print this object. So with that, there's tons of work being done, and I think it's only going to grow.
And there are libraries doing it. As I mentioned earlier, when I do my site visits to monitor what's going on with a grant to one of the state libraries, I go on the road and see some of the libraries. And Safe Harbor in Florida, it does a great job of working with people who are deaf. And I went there and saw book talks, et cetera, in sign language, Spanish and English, and working with different communities. I was really amazed by the work that was being done in Colorado. I blogged about the site I saw in Colorado, where actually it was a technology fellow who was very willing to work with the public library to develop robots. That's his goal. But to work with children who have autism or are on the spectrum. And, this is out there. There are people willing to work with libraries. So for those of you who are listening in on the streaming, please tell us what you're doing to celebrate ADA and how you're involved in providing services. And I think now we'll take some questions if anybody has any, whether you're online or, got a few. Great. Good to see.
Exciting.
Hello, I'm Steve Reeder from Portland, Oregon. I have a question for the panelists or possibly for the library community in this room or listening in online. And that is, I want to try and connect a couple dots that Lisa mentioned. One dot being we should buy accessible, books. Sounds like a great idea. And the other thing she said was she has funding for students in K-12 who need accessible books, to get them for no cost. My question is, are libraries buying accessible books to make available to adults with disabilities who need these products? Is that happening fast enough? Do we need to think about ways of doing that? I don't know the answer to that, but I think people listening may.
Well, I think that's a good question. I don't think we could answer exactly what libraries are doing out there. I think what your question brings up is how much more we need to share what we're doing with the community. I'm very pleased with this focus meetings because we get to highlight the grants that we give out. We go to ALA and we talk there about some of the work that we're doing, for instance, like her grant on 3D printing and students who are going to have needs and need assistive devices, etc. But I don't think we really are thinking about, we have some sections of our professional associations that specifically pull together information. But we need to do a lot more of that, sharing to understand, we're doing it. Because I'll tell you, I wouldn't know it unless I went on the road and saw in many cases, because we keep our lights under a barrel, especially for this kind of thing. I mean, we spend a lot of money on providing talking book services, and it's a well-kept secret. And while I'm on that topic, the National Library Service is doing a PR thing about their service. So contact them as well, because they will have materials or at least give you a lot more information if you want to put things forward to those listening in. And also the ADA Network has a toolkit to help you celebrate the ADA anniversary. And I think it's a good time for people to evaluate what they're doing. So I don't have an answer, but you bring up a good question about what can we do to find out more about what is going on in our field. Can we take another question?
Real quick, if you don't mind. One of the other things, too, is partnerships, right? So there are a number of organizations like NLS, like Bookshare, like Learning Ally, that have services. So, establishing partnerships and getting partnerships together could be something that we need to explore. How do we, support the libraries that, may not be doing the retrofitting themselves, but working with someone who is retrofitting things?
Hi, I'm Julie Walker. I'm the state librarian in Georgia, and I just wanted to comment quickly on something that we've done in Georgia. And Lisa had said earlier these services shouldn't be hidden. And what we realized is that we had some very invested libraries who served as our sub-regionals who were really doing great work. And the rest of our libraries felt like, okay, they're handling it, it's fine. And we decided we wanted every library in the state of Georgia to be providing accessible services. So we just held our first accessible services boot camp in Georgia, where we used some of our federal money to put on a statewide 3 to 4 day boot camp where representatives from every library in the state came and learned all the vast amount of information that they needed to better serve our patrons with disabilities of all kinds. And it was tremendously successful and so eye-opening for some of these libraries who had just felt like they could leave that to someone else. And now we've realized it's everyone's responsibility and it's everyone's task to serve these patrons and to serve them well and to make sure that they get to the services they need. So that's something that we really feel like our federal money was well spent to spread that word in Georgia.
Thank you.
Actually, I just wanted to add, James Lonergan from IMLS. The Association of Specialized Cooperative Library Agencies, ASCLA, actually has some wonderful training for working with people with disabilities. I actually did a training in Honolulu with our Pacific grantees, and they were just amazed by it. So I would highly recommend taking a look at ASCLA's materials as well. Other questions?
I'm Marlene Zentz with the University of Montana, and I wanted to respond to Steve's question. I have the good fortune of working with IMLS board member George Kirscher. George is really pushing the EPUB 3 format. If you're looking for accessible books, look for EPUB 3. George is working internationally to have that adopted as the format publishers are using. He is a wealth of knowledge. in that regard. And I feel very fortunate that he lives in Missoula, Montana, and is affiliated with the University of Montana. Both George and I feel that there's a need for staff development for librarians on all these issues that you touched on, and I really appreciate all your comments, Lisa. As an accessibility specialist, I help faculty, librarians, staff design accessible online learning environments, and I find that the librarians that come to me do not have that working knowledge in their formal training. So I just wonder if you could comment perhaps on the scope of the need for staff development in these very, very critical areas. The census for 2010, after the passage of the ADA, says that 1 in 5 people have a disability in the United States, and that's a huge number of patrons that don't always have inclusive, equitable access to library information and activities. So there's a need to understand disabilities. There's a need to understand the ever-evolving assistive technologies. There's ways to universally design activities. So this is a huge area, and I wonder if you could comment on what you feel is the need for professional development and support in libraries in this area.
I'm not sure if I can actually speak to your question, but I'll address one thing. I mean, training in general is always something that's necessary. Oftentimes people hear the words assistive technology and think, oh, that's too hard, I can't do that, right? But as I pointed out, of those of you who have your iPhone, some of that assistive technology actually happens on a device that you use on a regular basis. And I think just the understanding of the scope of what could be available and what could be available for a very inexpensive cost is not known. And so I think you're absolutely right that there's very much a need for training on disabilities and how to work with people with different and varying disabilities, but also what are the assistive technology devices that person might be using, or that might be something available to offer to people with different disabilities.
Do we have another question? I thought do we have time for one more question? Quick question? Okay.
Very quick one.
Okay. In the process, I will tell you that IMLS is working on a website on accessibility. We're working with the National Endowment for the Arts, and it'll be ready this fall. So look at IMLS website for more information on that.
This isn't a quick question, so I better not ask it. It's the miniature pony in the room. It's how many of us are having to cope with service animals in our libraries and trying to train our staff. And anybody else dealing with this, or am I the only one? No, we're all dealing with it. So we really could use specific training around service animals and the many people who want to bring in their iguanas because they're comfort animals. Thanks.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have a comment on that. That's not something that we actually do. But there are a number of organizations, and if you're interested, I can look and see who I can connect you with who might be able to help in that area.
And believe it or not, my understanding is there's only 10,000 service animals out there, which I thought they were a lot higher, given that. They're all in Sacramento. Okay.
Including the miniature ponies.
Thank you for raising
that sounds
that
like
issue.
a great. That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your hard work today, your contributions.